Hello and welcome. My name is Tani Ikeda. When I was young, I heard stories of the Japanese American experience because my dad would share them over the dinner table. He would share these stories after Densho did an interview with a Japanese American who lived during World War II. I remember especially the stories of strong women like Yuri Kochiyama and Aki Kurose, whose courageous voices would speak truth to power. In Facing the Mountain, the author Daniel James Brown highlights the lives of 4 Japanese American men who courageously faced their own challenges during World War II. These were stories I did not know as well, and as I read the book, I learned more deeply the pain and suffering of the men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and I was moved. A few days ago, working with the publishers, I finished a short piece to describe the book. I hope you enjoy it.
By and large, they had grown up like other American boys. Baseball and football, they made plans to go to college, or work in the family business, or run the farm someday. It seemed as if the whole world lay before them. But within hours of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, all that changed. Within days, the FBI was banging on their doors. Within weeks, many of them would watch as their immigrant parents were forced to sell their homes. Within months, tens of thousands of them would be living in barracks behind barbed wire. This is the story of those young men, resisting, rising up, standing on principle, laying down their lives, enduring and prevailing. Penguin Random House presents Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese American heroes in World War II by Daniel James Brown, read for you by Louis Ozawa.
Thank you for watching. It is now my deepest pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers. The first one is my father, Tom Ikeda. My dad is the founding executive director of Densho, a public history organization with a mission to preserve and share the stories of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans to promote equity and justice today. My dad will be in conversation with Daniel James Brown, the author of Facing the Mountain. Prior to writing Facing the Mountain, Dan wrote the book, The Boys in the Boat, that spent over 2.5 years on the New York Times bestsellers list and is being adapted as a major motion picture. Please help me welcome Tom and Dan.
Thank you, Tani, for that introduction and for the short video. It was a wonderful introduction to the book. And also I want to thank you for another proud dad moment. And thank you for all of you for joining us today. I just wanted to, before we start, to let you know that Tani, Dan Brown, and I have all been vaccinated. And so that's why we're not wearing masks and why we're sitting so closely together. And I know for some of you that's important. I want you to know that. But let's get started. And Dan, I guess my first question, this is an exciting time. Your book is now finally available. How does it feel?
Yeah, today's the day. I'm excited, I'm proud, I'm happy. There's always a little anxiety mixed in when you turn a book out into the world. It's a little bit like sending a kid out into the world for the first time. You love them, you understand them, you're not sure the rest of the world will, you hope they do. But I'm very excited and very happy that the day has come.
I mean, is it a little bit different? This is your 4th book. Does this feel different than the other 3?
You know, not really. Actually, every time you do this, again, it's sort of like sending kids out into the world. It's pretty much always the same. It's always a moment of excitement with just a little bit of anxiety mixed in.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the making of Facing the Mountain. And 5.5 years ago was when we met. And I remember that day clearly. We were both at an award ceremony. The mayor of Seattle, it was a Mayor's Arts Award. And you were there to accept an award for The Boys in the Boat, which I had read, and it was one of my favorite books. And I was very excited about meeting you. And I was there to accept an award for Densho and our work to collect and share the stories of the Japanese American experience. But I remember we were actually on stage kind of like this. The mayor was over there talking, and we started chatting. And I remember coming away from that conversation thinking, you're genuinely interested in the Japanese American history. And I wanted to get your take on that day and what you did following.
Yeah, so I've always been interested in Japanese American history, but I was absolutely fascinated. I didn't know anything about Densho at the time. And hearing you talk about the years you have spent collecting and archiving, curating, and making available all these firsthand accounts of Japanese Americans who've lived through different eras of our history, I just thought it was a fascinating opportunity to learn more. So I went home, I think it was that night or the next morning, I started delving into some of the interviews you've done, and I was just mesmerized by many of them.
Well, I remember when you started doing that, because you would email me or call me and said, hey, what about this interview, or do you have something like this? It was fun to actually work with you during this time.
And it was very helpful to go back and forth with you. The thing is, there were stories, of course, they were all about the Japanese American experience. They're also just, many of them were the kinds of stories I'm naturally drawn to. I'm all about story. I really am motivated by good storytelling. A lot of these were stories of ordinary people surmounting very, very difficult situations, overcoming great obstacles, persevering, struggling to survive, enduring difficult times. So they're the kinds of stories that got me going anyway. And the more that I saw, the more I listened to, the more convinced I was that it might be an opportunity to bring some of them out into the world in the form of a book.
Well, I'm so glad you discovered it, because I've been doing Densho for over 25 years. So I've talked literally with hundreds of writers, filmmakers, podcasters, educators who have approached me. They're interested in our materials, and they want to know how can we use the materials to create something. But you were doing something differently. I mean, you were really diving into the oral histories, which is really something that I'm passionate about. And so I remember that. But I also remember distinctly, after, it must have been almost like a year, where I started thinking, okay, so now it's going to be the fun part, because as you know, the story is very complex and it's very large, and there is no one simple master narrative of the Japanese American experience. There's so many circumstances, different perspectives. And so I was thinking, okay, so how did you navigate that? Did you go through that to find out, how you're going to tell the story in Facing the Mountain?
Yeah, and it's something I wrestled with for that first year, too. I didn't really want to try to write a comprehensive history of Japanese Americans. That would be really presumptuous, for one thing. It also just isn't what I do. I tell stories. I wanted to weave together the personal stories of some individuals that would shed some light on the history. And what I finally settled on was I realized that young draft age Japanese American men, Nisei men of draft age, right after Pearl Harbor, they all faced this sort of dilemma. Like, what do you do? Our families are being incarcerated, our businesses are being taken away from our parents, there's all this racial animosity in the air. All other young Americans are signing up to serve in the military. What should I do? And it's a really interesting dilemma, and dilemma is always what drives good stories. So I decided to focus on that part of the story.
Yeah, and I remember when you first started, you were asking me, is there like one person or one family? Yeah. And I said, no, you probably have to do about 12.
Yeah.
But you got down to 4.
Right.
And so let's talk about these 4 men that you focus on.
Yeah.
The first one is, I know him well because he grew up in the Seattle area, Gordon Hirabayashi. Tell me about Gordon and his role, especially in terms of standing up to the government and what they did during World War II, the Japanese Americans.
Yeah, so Gordon was a student at the University of Washington when the war began. He was also a Quaker and a conscientious objector. Understanding the context that Gordon is in Seattle attending the university, and a curfew is imposed on anybody of Japanese ancestry. And then within a few months, people are beginning to be forced to get on buses and leave their homes and their businesses and be taken away to assembly centers and ultimately to concentration camps. This is the situation that Gordon faced in the spring of 1942. What makes Gordon really interesting is that he decides not to get on the bus. And so he winds up being the last and only Japanese American living in Seattle in early 1942. And to me, that represents a kind of bravery that some of the guys we're going to talk about in a little bit demonstrated their bravery very obviously on the battlefields in Europe. But Gordon, to me, is a different face of bravery, a different kind of bravery. And I really thought that it was important to show that side of the story. And Gordon was really the perfect vehicle to do that.
Yeah, we're going to show a clip of Gordon sort of making that decision. And it's interesting, you did a lot of work with oral histories. And I thought it'd be interesting for the viewers to be able to actually see some of the materials that, that you researched. And so the clip we're going to see is actually that scene that you were talking about where he's at the University of Washington in the library with some of his white classmates. The curfew's 8 p.m. and it's just a few minutes before 8 p.m. So let's take a look at this clip.
And then one day, I'm dashing home. Hey, Gordon, it's 5 to 8. I grab my stuff and it takes about 5 minutes to get home. So I'm just dashing home, and it hit me. A question that I should have faced earlier, it just hit me. How come I'm dashing home and all your timekeepers are still there? It just needed the question to be raised. I knew I couldn't answer it, you know, without saying, I can't do it. I turned around and went back to the library. Hey, what's the matter? And I said, well, you guys are here. We got work to do. I said, I got work to do too. I decided if you guys are here, I'm gonna work with you. I'll go back when you guys are ready to go. Nobody turned me in. And I didn't take that until it hit me. And when it hit me, I knew, gosh, I can't do it. That's two-faced.
Yeah, so after that decision, then, as you said, you know, he then defied the exclusion order. But when you watch that clip, what comes to mind?
I mean, it's a perfect illustration of Gordon was very much a man who operated on principles. He had very strong principles. He was very careful and meticulous in the way he laid them out. Shortly after that moment in the library came the moment when he declined to get on the bus and be taken to camp. Instead, he wrote out a statement to the FBI laying out in sort of constitutional terms why he felt that the exclusions and the incarcerations were illegal and unconstitutional. And he took that statement, he went downtown Seattle and turned himself into the FBI. And that began what turned out to be a legal battle that went on through the entire war and saw Gordon incarcerated in first the King County Jail and then a work farm in Arizona and finally a federal prison, and his case was appealed up to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, Gordon, after he passed away, President Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom for what he had done, for the courage he had shown in defending his principles.
Yeah, one of the highlights of my time at Densho was a little over 20 years ago, I had the opportunity to interview Gordon and had like 5 interviews. And as you say, he was an extraordinary man, really clear thinking, very principled. You know, you talked a little bit about his courage, and I want to now talk about the other 3 men. And they exhibited, you know, in some ways a different bravery, a different courage than Gordon, but still very courageous. You know, all 3 of them served with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And this was a segregated Japanese American infantry unit that fought in Europe. Tell me a little bit about the 442nd.
Yeah, the 442nd was put put together after initially refusing to let Japanese American men enlist in the service in early 1943. The Roosevelt administration reversed course and decided to create a segregated all-Japanese American fighting unit. I should mention that before they were formed, there was a pre-existing group, the 100th Infantry Battalion, which was formed in Hawaii from Japanese Americans who had already been in the service when the war broke out, and that the service couldn't discharge them because of anti-discrimination laws. So they sort of set them aside. Eventually they began to train them for combat. They became the 100th Infantry Battalion and wound up eventually fighting side by side with the 442 in Europe. But the 442 was an all-volunteer, all-Japanese American fighting force that ultimately saw very heavy combat in Italy, France, and Germany, and fought with great distinction and wound up being one, if not the most decorated unit of its size in American military history.
Okay, so the next man we're going to focus on is Katsugo Miho, and his nickname was Katz. And he was a member of the 442nd. Tell me a little bit about Katz Miho.
So Katz Miho grew up on Maui at a time when Maui and the other Hawaiian islands were pretty much all run as plantations, sugar cane and pineapple plantations. And these plantations, of course, were racially segregated, absolutely brutal working conditions, particularly for the first generation immigrants that came to work in the cane fields in particular. But Katz grew up in that environment of plantation Hawaii. When Pearl Harbor happened, he actually was a student at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu, and he actually witnessed the bombing of Pearl Harbor from the roof of his residence hall. Immediately after that, because he was a member of the campus ROTC, he went across the street to the campus and joined hundreds of other young, mostly Japanese American ROTC men. And they were formed into something called the Hawaii Territorial Guard. And that night, Katz found himself patrolling the Honolulu waterfront with a gun he didn't really know how to use.
Yeah, so we're going to show that clip. Yeah. But before we do that, I just wanted to tell you that I really enjoyed your account of the Japanese Americans in Hawaii. You know, most of my research has been on the mainland, and especially those who went to the concentration camps. And the Hawaii experience was very different, and it was just really fascinating, especially when you talked about Maui and some of the outer islands. But you know, as you mentioned, Katz joined the Hawaii Territorial Guard. So this next clip is of Katz talking about his experiences with the Guard. So let's take a look at this.
Our group of University of Hawaii students were dropped off as guards over an area in the dark on 4-hour shifts. And for 2-3 nights in a row, we were serving as, I don't know what we would have done, because we were given a loaded rifle. We were given a loaded rifle with 5 rounds of ammunition. We didn't even know how to fire the gun. But we were given this rifle. We were told, you load it this way, and this is the way how you lock it in case anything happens. And to this day, I wonder, what was if anything happened was what they were referring to, because not that nothing happened, but what if anything had happened, what were we supposed to do, because we were not giving any kind of orders. A month and a half later, early in the morning, we got called up and said, hey, we're going to report down to Lanakila Intermediate School. And we woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. They woke us up at 2 o'clock. And then finally, about 5:30, a truck came by to pick us up. We were all fully packed and everything. We dropped us off at Lanakila. We wondered what was going on. We found out that the whole battalion was assembled at Lanakila. And then Major Frazier, who was the acting commander of the battalion, came up and told us point blank, right straight in our face, he says, the reason why you are here this morning is because all you Americans or Japanese, I'm pretty sure he referred to it, American or Japanese ancestry, because of your ethnic background, you are being discharged herein right off the bat, right as of now, you are being discharged from the Hawaiian territory. Only the AJAs. And completely still a shock.
I really like that clip. I mean, there's a lot in there. You know, there's that part where he was smiling at the absurdity of these young men, really untrained, being given rifles and a handful of bullets to guard the islands. And then the end. I mean, what did you see in this?
Yeah, I mean, that moment when they were discharged, what a slap in the face. These young men, like millions of young American men, wanted to do something, wanted to serve their country. And in the pre-dawn darkness on an athletic field, they're told they're not welcome to serve anymore. It was a terrible rebuke. It hurt many of them terribly. Some of them mentioned that in the darkness around them, they could hear other young men crying because they were so devastated by this decision. And for Katsumiho, it was just a huge blow.
Yeah, I remember that point in the book, and it happened fairly early. And I remember getting choked up by that scene. It was very powerful. So let's go to the next man. And for that, let's come back to the mainland and go to California. We're going to talk about Rudy Tokiwa. And Rudy, I interviewed 23 years ago, and he's still one of my favorites. He's such a powerful storyteller, lots of details, so you can get a lot of information. What did you think of Rudy?
Yeah, Rudy's a really interesting guy. He served in the 442nd. His Army nickname was Punch Drunk. He tended to get into trouble quite a bit. But he had just this huge heart. And he grew up in Salinas on a farm that his family was evicted from after Pearl Harbor. They were taken first to the Salinas Assembly Center, which is just a fairgrounds, and then they were taken to Poston concentration camp in Arizona. But Rudy was one of the young men who volunteered for the 442nd, coming out of one of the camps. And he wound up serving in what's called K Company in the 442nd.
And so we're going to show a clip of Rudy. But before we do this, it's after some intense fighting in France, in the Vosges Mountains. Tell me a little bit about that fighting.
Yeah, so in the fall of 1943, the 442nd had been fighting for months in Italy. They were transported to northern France, right on the German border, on the edge of what's called the Vosges Forest or the Vosges Mountains. They were tasked with liberating a town called Bruyères, which is a village with intersecting highways and railroad lines. And they fought very heavily to do that. They liberated this town, and then they pushed beyond the town to a little village called Bifontaine. And they took terrible casualties. It was muddy and rainy and cold and very grim fighting conditions. But they finally liberated the territory they were supposed to. They were given leave to find a barn or a shed or something to sleep in for a few days. But then they were suddenly awakened in the middle of the night. And what had happened, the commanding general, General Dahlquist, had ordered a unit of what was called the Texas Division, young men mostly from Texas and Oklahoma, to go deeper into the Vosges. And some of them had gone too far into the Vosges and been cut off by the Germans and were trapped on the end of a long ridge line, surrounded by Germans. Many of them were injured, dying. Some of them had gangrene. They ran out of medical supplies. They ran out of food. They didn't have any drinkable water. So they were in a desperate situation. Dahlquist had ordered them out too far, and it was really largely responsible for what had happened. So he became quite desperate to rescue them. He sent a series of other units up into the mountains to try to get them out, and none of them were able to do so. So finally, as I say, he woke the Nisei soldiers up, the 442nd soldiers up in the middle of the night, and sent them up the mountain to try to reach and rescue what came to be called the Lost Battalion.
And this was, I think unusual. You mentioned Bruyères and Bifontaine and the heavy casualties. I've talked to some military historians, and they would say, in today's Army, they would be viewed as non-effective. They had lost so many men already that they weren't really enough to really be an effective fighting unit.
Right.
And yet they were ordered to go rescue these people after other full-strength units could not save them.
Yeah, their fighting capacity had already been severely degraded before they were even sent up on that rescue mission.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible story. And then the clip we're going to see is Rudy talking about the aftermath of the rescue, where General Dahlquist wants to acknowledge the troops in what's called a retreat parade. And at full strength, the 442nd is about 4,000 men. But after all those battles and fighting, after the deaths, the wounded, the people who are sick, there were less than 1,000 men, at this retreat parade. And so let's take a look at this clip and what happens.
The 36th Division commander wanted the 442nd to pass in review. And he said, all personnel of the 442nd will pass in review. So the 442nd passes in review, and like I say, you got 3 battalions plus headquarters, and they don't even have a battalion out there passing in review. So General Dahlquist turned around and he said to the colonel, when I order everyone to pass in review, I mean the cooks and everybody will pass in review. And Chaplain Yamada said, this is the first time I saw the colonel cry. And he said, this is all I have left.
I remember that moment when Rudy, told me that story, and in your book you captured it, so powerfully, and what happened. And Rudy goes on in the interview where, he continues to cry about, how many people were killed, and how many of them had families who were still in American concentration camps, and just how horrible, how difficult it was for these men. And I just remember that. And what did this clip do for you?
I had the same reaction. I mean, I think that seeing Rudy's story was one of the things that convinced me to write this book, frankly, and one of the things that convinced me that Rudy should be one of these sort of central characters in the story. As I say, he had so much heart, and he shows it there. He lets you see the pain and the humiliation that he felt when they were so disrespected in that incident, and the pain of losing so many friends on that mountainside.
Yeah. So let's go to the fourth man, and that's Fred Shiosaki. We're going to go back to Washington State and Eastern Washington, where some people don't realize, the state of Washington was divided into Western Washington and Eastern Washington, where Western Washington people were removed and placed in camps. On Eastern Washington, in cities like Spokane, they weren't. So tell me about Fred Shiosaki.
Yeah, so Fred grew up in a neighborhood in Spokane called Hilliard, which at the time was a pretty rough neighborhood. It was actually, it was largely an immigrant neighborhood right down by the rail yards in Spokane or in Hilliard. And there was a place that a lot of racial slurs got thrown around casually. Fred grew up in that environment, and Fred grew up, he's really intrinsically a very gentle, sweet-natured, soft-spoken man. But he learned to be very tough in that environment. He often got in fist fights. In fact, his father complained because he kept coming home with broken eyeglasses, and his father, who was running this laundry in Hilliard, had to keep trying to resupply him with expensive eyeglasses. So he grew up in Hilliard. He grew up knowing how to fight, but not somebody that particularly wanted to fight. And he also when the war broke out, he tried to enlist immediately. Japanese Americans were not allowed to enlist, so he had to wait until the 442nd was created. He then did enlist immediately, and wound up in K Company with Rudy, and wound up being one of the men that went up the mountain after the Lost Battalion.
And I know you're very fond of Fred. Of the four men, up until just a month ago, he was the only surviving member of those four characters. Tell me a little bit about your relationship and the discussions you had with Fred.
Yeah, so as you say, Fred was of the four that I profile in the book, Fred was the only one who was still alive. And so I was able to spend quite a bit of time with him. His son Michael facilitated some really good conversations with him. And that really helped me to get a sense of Fred's this sort of inner resolve and the sort of core of steel that, to me, is one of the most prominent things about Fred. And so that was a real blessing to be able to meet him. But, for these other guys, I had the blessing of all your recorded interviews with them. And I was able to spend many, many hours listening and re-listening to Rudy and Katz and to Gordon Hirabayashi because of the archives that you and others have put together.
Yeah, there's something I wanted to mention about the Katz Miho interview. You've actually found that in Hawaii.
Yeah.
This was done by the Center for Oral History at the University of Hawaii, where you did a lot of research.
Yeah.
And the interviewers for that one was Warren Nishimoto and Michiko Kodama Nishimoto. But we're going to see a clip of Fred, and you'll get a sense of him. And this clip is when it's after the war, and he's returning to Spokane by train, and he meets another soldier. So let's take a look at this clip.
I was on the train by myself, and we stopped in Washington, D.C. And I was actually, from that railroad station, you could see the Capitol building. I'm sure that must have been the Union Station. And I was sitting there looking out the window, and this GI came out, I think he's a buck sergeant, and he stopped and he looked at me and he looked at my patch. He says, "Hey, you were there for 42nd." Yeah. He says, "Were you at the Lost Battalion?" And I said, "Yeah, I was there." He says, "I was in there."
So he was one of the 200 men that you rescued?
Yeah. Anyway, it's one of those things. I could just feel myself getting I was angry, God, and I turned to him and I said, "Do you know how many men we lost getting you guys out of there? You know how many of my friends died in there?" And well, he said, you know, if you guys were in there, we'd have come after you." And I shook my head and I said, "Well," he said, "anyway, I want to thank you." He put out his hand and I turned away and looked out the window.
Yeah, this was another good clip, and Fred goes on and talks about, in some ways, how embarrassed and shamed he was that he didn't shake the hand, and even called it kind of irrational that he didn't do that. But yet, he said he was just so angry, he was so raw, his emotions, and he just couldn't do it. And what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. Fred and Rudy and all these guys, to some extent, came home, if not wounded physically, then wounded emotionally to a large extent. A lot of them carried a lot of pain home with them about what had happened. Fred moved back in with his family, living over the laundry in Hilliard, and for months his mother had to wake him up in the middle of the night because he was screaming. He clearly had PTSD. So, they lost a lot of friends in the course of the war, particularly in that battle, but in other battles as well. And it was a pain they carried with them, as soldiers do, for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate Fred because he wasn't afraid to talk about his emotions. I think his nickname was Rosie.
Yes.
And when he got angry, his cheeks would get red, or if he got embarrassed, his cheeks would turn bright red, and that's how he got his nickname.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of go back to kind of the making of the book. You wrote this book in the last 5.5 years, and it was a very turbulent time. I remember at the beginning when you first started, there were things happening with the presidential campaign, and the candidate Trump was talking about the rapists and murderers from Mexico. And this negative rhetoric, I remember thinking, oh, this rhymes with some of the things I studied about Japanese Americans and the name calling. And then we had the Muslim travel ban, where because the country said because of national security, we're not going to allow travel from these predominantly Muslim countries. And again, that rhymed with this concept of, well, we have to put Japanese Americans in camp because there is a military necessity. These people are dangerous. Not really true. Then we were talking during the killing of George Floyd and the aftermath and the discussions of racism. And then more recently, the anti-Asian hate that's going around because of the COVID pandemic. And so all this was happening when you were writing the book. And I wanted to ask you, how did that affect your writing and you as you did this book?
Yeah, well, it was certainly helped me decide what I wanted to foreground in the story. As you say, I was reading about these hardworking Japanese immigrants trying to make a life in America and all they were going through in order to become or try to become Americans at the same time that there was all this anti-immigrant rhetoric. I was reading about families being torn apart by the incarcerations of the Japanese Americans at the same time that families were being torn apart on the southern border. So there, as you say, it all rhymed and it was pretty obvious. The parallels were quite obvious. So, it didn't change the facts that I was writing about, but it did certainly help motivate me to make clear the consequences of those kinds of rhetoric and those kinds of actions on real people. I think if you personalize history by telling the stories of in this case, 4 individuals, it helps people empathize a little bit better. So all that was going on, and that did inform how I was thinking about the story. But something else happened, which was that I spent a lot of time just doing historical research into the backgrounds of Asian Americans living in America. So, and I knew this to some extent because I'd grown up in California, but I didn't realize the extent of it. I spent a lot of time reading about anti-Chinese violence at the time of the gold rush and immediately after the gold rush, lynchings and burnings and people being run out of town. And then during the Yellow Peril, what they called the Yellow Peril era, around the end of the 19th century and the 20th century, there arose all this, again, anti-immigrant, anti-Asian rhetoric. And there were certain images and tropes and phrases that came up, equating Asians with insects and rats and plagues and vermin. And so it was really kind of eye-opening to me because I realized that as I was writing about Pearl Harbor and the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, that those same images and tropes and racist language were being recycled. They were being pulled up and used again in the wake of Pearl Harbor. And then more recently, in the wake of COVID especially, we see again the same kinds of imagery. When President Trump talked about Kung Flu, you see this imagery of pestilence and disease being recycled yet again, brought up, used in the same way it's been used periodically. So it just gave me a sense for how deeply embedded some of these ideas and images are in the American consciousness.
No, I'm glad you're talking about this because when I read the book, it's you get engrossed into the stories of the characters in the book, and you get so involved personally with the stories. But then when you walk away from the book a little bit and start thinking about what you did, you frame these issues in ways that, racism, xenophobia, all those things were there. And it just rang so true in terms of also what was going on with this, our country today. So I really appreciate this. Before we wrap up, we collected some questions from the audience we're going to ask, and so I'm going to kind of move forward. And so the first question from the audience is, you focused on 4 men as the main characters, and yet the stories of women are very important. How did you handle that in the book?
Yeah, so because I defined the book when I started as sort of this dilemma that Nisei men faced at the beginning of the war, the principal characters were, of course, all men. But they all had wives and mothers and sisters and aunts, and their lives and their experiences, both in the concentration camps and outside the camps, being the mothers of sons that went off to war, and so on. All those stories are interwoven throughout because these young men didn't live in vacuums, they lived in families, and their families are really a very important part of the narrative I'm trying to tell. One of the most interesting of those to me actually was Katsumiho's sister, Fumie. Fumie had moved to Japan just before the war, largely to escape the racism in Maui, and as I say, the plantation system in Maui. She moved to Japan, and then the war broke out, and she got stranded in Japan. She was an American citizen. So we see in the book, we see Fumie in Japan at the beginning of the war, and things get very hard for her. She's living with another sister and her brother-in-law in Tokyo, and things get very hard for them as the war progresses. And then we see her again towards the end of the war. In order to escape the fire bombings in Tokyo and other cities, Fumie and her sister and her brother-in-law moved to a village just outside of Hiroshima. And Fumie had a job in central Hiroshima, but the morning of the bombing of Hiroshima, she missed her train.
We're talking about the atomic bomb.
The atomic bomb.
Right.
She missed her train, so she was at the train station waiting for the next train into Hiroshima when she witnessed the bomb. I mean, she was close enough to see the mushroom cloud and all that. And then she went, actually the next day, she got on the train when the trains got running again, and she worked her way into central downtown Hiroshima, trying to find a colleague from work, trying to find a friend, wandering through the remains of Hiroshima, trying to help people, and of course, an absolutely horrific scene. So it acts as kind of interesting bookends to the story, to see things from that point of view.
No, I remember that, and you covered it pretty in depth, because I remember also her feelings of being Japanese American in Japan, and really from her perspective.
Yeah.
So the next question from the audience is actually for me. So the question is, many veterans are reluctant to talk about their war experiences, as have been the Japanese American families who were incarcerated. And so the question is, Tom, so what has been your own family experience? So this is a good time to give some context about my family. Both my parents and all 4 of my grandparents lived in Seattle before the war. They were rounded up and removed and eventually went to the Minidoka, Idaho concentration camp. And when I was starting the project 25 years ago, I remember this conversation with my dad. My dad said, essentially, you shouldn't do this project. And the reason he was saying this was, he said, there are so many painful memories, tensions in the community, that if you go around and start asking these questions of the community, it's going to bring up a lot of negative feelings. And I told my dad, I said, no, I really need to do this. And he said, well, then be careful, be sensitive. And I didn't realize that what would result was I was going to learn a lot about my family. My mom, this was after like 10, 12 years of doing Densho, and I'm out there doing interviews and learning about it. One day I was at my parents' house, and my mom was the only one there. And she said, come and look at this old photo album. And we went through it, and she came to this photograph of my grandparents accepting the American flag at the Minidoka concentration camp. My mom's oldest brother was killed in action fighting with the 100th Battalion of the 442. And I knew this, but this photograph was very stark. But it was the story after that she told me that was really, really painful. She said when her older brother tried to volunteer for the 442nd, he failed the physical. And so Bachan, my grandmother, gave him a home remedy, some herbal remedy. And so he was able to pass the physical. And so he joined the 442nd, became a staff sergeant, but was killed in action in Italy. And when my grandfather, my Jichan, found out, he was so despondent. He was in despair. He was angry. And in that moment, he lashed out at my grandmother, saying that because you helped him get into the army, you killed him. And my mother was a witness to all this. And I know she told me how traumatic that was. And that was, an example of some of the painful stories that my dad said that, they're really hard. But then having thought about this and talking to my dad, I'm so glad that I did learn about this story, because I learned a lot about my family and who I am. So let's go to the final question from the audience. And this has to do with the impact of your work. Recently we heard news that the filmmaker, Destin Daniel Cretton, is going to do a screen adaptation of Facing the Mountain. And so I know you've been in conversation with Destin. Tell me a little bit about Destin and his interest in this story.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. Destin, first of all, Destin grew up on Maui, rural Maui, and I think he has a very good sense of the Hawaii experience part of this story. And I know he's very passionate about telling the story. So I'm very much looking forward to working with him, and I hope with you on that project. In my opinion, he's an absolutely brilliant filmmaker. He made most recently a film called Just Mercy, which is about a black civil rights lawyer and a death penalty case. It's very moving. And he's working now on a Marvel action film called Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, which is going to be an absolutely huge production. I think he's the right person to tell the story for many reasons, partly his background, but most of all because he's one of the most empathetic people that I have ever met, frankly. And this really comes through in his filmmaking. You really feel what the characters in his films are experiencing. And that's very much what I strive for in my books. And so I'm very hopeful that will translate well through Destin's creativity, translate onto the screen. I'm just extremely excited about it.
Yeah, no, I am too. And I think it's interesting that you have a filmmaker like Destin who has read the book and is just so interested for its storytelling sort of potential. And you're talking with me, a public historian who spent 25 years diving into the story. And so historical accuracy is just so important to me. And I think this is one of your extraordinary strengths of being able to provide a narrative to a historical event in such a moving way that's historically accurate. But I wanted to kind of end though to also let people know how it was working with you, because more than being a great writer, the sensitivity, the curiosity, your generosity of spirit as we went through this was really meaningful. And I've been doing this for 25 years, and I think I'm coming to the end of my career eventually. But to be able to work on this project with you has been really meaningful. And I just wanted to thank you, Dan, for allowing me to be part of this.
Tom, thank you. I mean, we've been on quite a journey together, and it's been really one of the most rewarding times of my life. And this book literally would not even begin to exist without all the work you've done. And not just in compiling the archives at Densho, but all the support you've given the project the book project along the way. So I'm just enormously grateful. And I'm also very grateful. I know that some of these folks are listening tonight. The family members of many of the people that I profile in the book have also just been enormously helpful. So I want to thank all of you also for all the time you have spent with me, going over letters and photographs and sharing memories of your loved ones. I hope I've done justice to the memories of those you love.
Wow, thank you, Dan. And so, I want to end by thanking all of you for listening in today. If you want more information about the book, you can go to danieljamesbrown.com. And if you want to learn more about Japanese American history, you can go to densho.org. But with that, my last request is, get the book and read it. I think you'll really enjoy it. And thank you and goodbye.